Everyone. I see everybody starting to join, so we'll just wait a couple seconds as the numbers just climb up.
I always find this like beginning part when you do like the live webinars is always an interesting, there's like that moment of transition of leading to let everyone come in and then you're like, I think we've settled in now. I think we can maybe get rolling. I
Every
feel like it
regular.
happens every one of these webinars when we used to do them.
Yeah, goodness. Okay, well, you know what? I see a bunch of people here already, which is amazing. So we'll just start getting started. My name is Olivia Stibbe. I go by Lynn. I am one of your co-hosts slash moderators slash timekeeper for today. And I'm a bit of a new face for our fourth season, but Jesse, if you want to give a little introduction for yourself, you are one of our founding people.
Thanks, Liv. Jesse Adams, president and founder of Ember, and super excited to be here and share some of the experiences I get to do in terms of talking to really cool and interesting people about things that I really care about in relation to how do we support people inside of our workplace and hopefully create a space where people enjoy their work a little bit more and leave feeling a little bit more charged.
That's perfect. I also forgot to mention even like what I do. I am a writer. I am an author. I am a moderator, host. I do a bunch of different hats, but for today, I'm very excited to be tapping into this conversation with Jesse. And I know, like, as I mentioned, this is my first time, on this series. It's the fourth season, and Jesse, you've been here with the first three. I know that it's pretty amazing. And our audience might have seen that there is a little bit of a change in the name and the branding and all that good stuff. And why don't we just start, Will, with you telling us about the problem that we're trying to solve with this series and like what happened
Mm.
with rebrand? Why are we rebranding?
Yeah, when I saw you like position that, I was like, why? I know like there's a lot of things and thoughts and intention behind it. But what stuck to me and what I've come to learn in the work that I get to do every day, where I'm supporting leaders and organizations with their culture, and even just as a person, I noticed that we can sometimes get really fixated on the operational demands or the tasks of things that we're supposed to do every day, and we might not always be intentional or even aware of what might be the wake or the waves that we're creating around us as we do those things as an individual or as an organization. And so I spend a lot of time supporting other people and even with myself, trying to create more intention with how we move through the world and perhaps even reframe the current perspective we have of an issue. One as I can think of that stuck to me as I was thinking about this question. In the summer, I was up at a cottage with my two oldest daughters. And for those that have kids, you know that like the bedtime situation is always a struggle. And like at some point, you're just like, I just need you to stay in bed so I can, have a second to breathe. And there was one point where my oldest came out and I was sitting on the deck, kind of overlooking the water, just reflecting and listening to some music. And she snuck out. And my initial response was like to get up and like kind of get her back to bed. And I caught myself, fortunately, and I was like, you want to come sit with me? And the biggest smile came on. And then we sat there for like 40 minutes and we're talking about such random things. And it just was like this moment of like, where I took an opportunity to move towards what's the experience that we could have here versus the operational demand of making sure we get to sleep and da 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 da. And I think that happens, as we navigate work, as we are a leader trying to keep up with all the demands. That sometimes we don't always just pause to think of what could be the action that best serves me. And so I thought, let's have a forum where we can talk about some of those actions, talk about some of the pressures we might be feeling, and perhaps just create some awareness as to, again, what might be the best action to move through the challenges we're facing. And so that was really behind the idea. And we just felt like intention was such a key word in that let's try to be more intentional with how we are moving through the world, even though recognizing that we're not going to be perfect all the time.
Yeah, yeah, and you can see intention is also the key of the name of this webinar. Now it's
Yeah.
intentional shift.
Yeah.
It's maintaining mental fitness. So it's been a bit of a name change, but it's the same great content and with amazing speakers and all of that great stuff. Now, I know that today everybody's joined. You're expecting us to be talking about fostering psychologically safe workplaces. That's exactly what we're doing here. And maybe you're a leader of people or just a leader in your work environment, but we do have some amazing experts that are going to be here to talk with us. They'll pop up in just a second. But before, maybe Jesse, if you want to, I know that we were chatting a little while ago, and one of your coaching clients, I believe, you had a story about how we talk about psychological safety and just about fostering that in culture. And I just wanted to see if you could set the tone for everybody about what even this
Yeah,
is and
sure.
how it relates.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so first, like in terms of the conversation for today, I wanted to also differentiate the idea of psychological safety versus psychological health and safety. The key point in the two is, for me, psychological safety focuses a lot more on the social exchanges that occur through the norms that are created within, either as a leader or as an individual, where psychological health and safety leans more towards like the infrastructure and systems that are created to support hopefully those norms, but might lean to things like a psychological health and safety management system and such. But what I've come to learn in relation to the work I get to do with leaders is when we put it through the terms of social exchange, in terms of what is the exchange that's happening as we're facilitating a work environment that really is about modeling, supporting, and rewarding vulnerability. What occurs and what might the levels be that happen? And one scenario that you're speaking to there is I got brought in to work with the team, very operational in relation to the type of work they would do. A lot of field operatives, as well as in having a leader, and a lot of tension between the groups. A lot of feelings of distrust, fear, kind of armored behavior, pointing fingers. Like you just sense there's a lot of gaps in safety. And in working with one of the leaders, we started to move into the space of talking about vulnerability and talking about like, could we be vulnerable? And even the idea of that became something that was not possible. Feeling as for that particular leader working in a unionized environment, like if I share something about making a mistake or share something about my feelings, I'm going to get exposed or taken, or I might even get fired because of it. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions and fear about what psychological safety might be and how to create that and how to be vulnerable. Like it's not about dumping your entire trunk of emotions and everything on the front lawn for everyone to see. And so, again, I thought this has to be something that many leaders, and I know I've come across it, are experiencing. So let's create some space to talk about it from people that are leaders in the industry, both from a subject matter perspective, as well as trying to do this within their own teams. And so, yeah, I'm super excited to chat about it because I think it's a topic that many individuals struggle with, both either on the leader side or the individual side, of like, how do we foster this environment where people feel psychologically safe, in which they belong, they can learn, they can contribute effectively, and they can also often challenge the status quo inside of the organization.
Amazing. Yeah, a wealth of knowledge. So I'm excited to actually even just be a witness to the conversation that we're about to have. But so we have two guests. So I will introduce each of them on their own. So we have Lilian Riad-Allen, and Lilian is a behavioral neuroscience, psychological health and safety leader, and an ICF certified coach dedicated to creating psychological safety in challenging environments. She also actually hosts a podcast. So if you have Spotify or something, go over there. It's Lil on Life, where she shares insights on purpose, positive relationships, life's funny moments. Lilian, if you want to turn on your camera, we'll get a little hello, a little wave. And for our audience, I didn't mention, but she's also a ravioli maker. So I think if enough of us say we want recipes, she might be able to put together some kind of recipe book for us. She sounds like she has some incredible ravioli recipes. So welcome, Lilian. We're really excited. And I will also introduce Jordan Friesen. And Jordan is a mental health leader with expertise in developing national workplace mental health programs, guiding organizations toward progressive support for employee well-being. And drawing from his own experiences with illness and recovery, he champions a person-centered approach to creating healthier, more human workplaces. Jordan, give us a little wave. Hi. Okay,
Hey,
so we
folks.
have we have these
I
two.
don't have a podcast, by the way, worth noting. I don't. I'm sorry.
I know
It
ravioli.
always it feels like you're a little bit like when you hear Lillian's like extensive list, but then the cool part is like when you get to talk to both of you, really, it's like some of my favorite humans in the whole world to interact with. So yeah, thanks so much. But I know the feeling, Jordan, where you're like, oh gosh, there's a lot to live up to.
And
Um, Go ahead,
sorry.
or
No, I was to say,
Liv.
just before we jump into everything, I just wanted to let everybody know that we will have a Q&A session at the end, I promise. So if you put everything into the Q&A box, I will go through and I will ask your questions for you after we're kind of done the bulk of things. And I think I see somebody's hand raised. If you want to put something in the chat, maybe we can address it right away. Yeah, so we will do that. But for now, Lillian and Jordan, I want to ask you just what's top of mind, and then I think Jesse's going to take over some of the actual meaty questions. But Lillian, if you want to answer first, what is top of mind for you?
Yeah, thanks, Liv, and thank you all for having us today. I think what's coming up and what's top of mind is just the immense amount of gratitude I'm feeling for all of you making the time to have this conversation. Like Jesse said, it can come with some vulnerability and some discomfort, but being in this field for as long as I have, I love that we're having these conversations front and center. And so I'm just feeling overcome with gratitude for the effort, the support, and your attention.
Always. Yeah, gratitude is, we're talking about that, so important. And Jordan, what's top of mind for you?
Yeah, what's top of mind for me is it's actually pretty similar in that if I think about 4 or 5 years ago, diving in with a focus so intently on kind of human experiences at work, uh, I don't think there were many organizations, groups, associations doing that or focusing on it. And so for me, what's top of mind is that this is probably not a conversation we would have been having half a decade ago. And what a drastic shift, perhaps even an intentional shift that we've experienced in our workplaces. You see what I did there?
Yeah,
I've got more puns. Don't worry, it'll
yeah,
happen. But that's what's top of mind for me. I think similarly, gratitude that we're having these conversations because obviously a more human workplace is something that I'm really passionate about.
awesome. Maybe in terms of our first question, because I know we prefaced a little bit about how we think about psychological safety and what goes on. I'm kind of curious in working with clients, and maybe we'll throw to you, Jordan, specifically on this one. How do you view psychological safety, like when you're supporting the organizations you get to work with?
Well, how I view it and how another organization might view it, there's often some discrepancy. And Jesse, I'm glad at the front end you clarified what psychological health and safety is versus psychological safety. That's often discussion point number one. And in Canada, there's been a standard for psychological health and safety for well over a decade now. But the conversation around psychological safety is newer and more nuanced as well. Typically, how I talk about it is a focus around employee voice and really employers figuring out how to empower and use employee voice for the benefit of everyone, including their company. And another misconception I think that I often hear is that psychological safety is something that exists and is influenced at sort of an organizational level. And that's also something that we unpack really early on is that, based on the research and the concept as well, how it's defined, it's something that's really unique to teams. And even a conversation about what makes a team is also interesting learning right off the bat. So when I think psychological safety, I immediately think of employee voice. I think of how we empower that microculture within teams, and very quickly that goes to what a leader's responsibility is to do that. So that's where the conversation usually goes, and it's usually a bit of education to help us all get on the same page. So we're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, one that even I hear a lot, and maybe I'll preface and I'll put you on the spot, Lillian, on this. I feel like we chatted a little bit about it too. Is like even not only compared to psychological safety and psychological health and safety, I also think about it as relates to like safe spaces. And I think sometimes they're put into one idea where it's like, hey, we're not going to have any discomfort at all. Everyone's going to feel perfect and fine and lovely all the time. And that's really, to me, not a part of psychological safety. Like, obviously, everyone's entitled to belong. Then as you move across the continuum, there's going to be discomfort in learning, or there's going to be discomfort in being challenged. And I'm just curious, Lillian, if either that specifically, or if there's any other ones that stick out for you as misconceptions in your work.
Yeah, well, I think there's so many. And again, that's I think why I'm so excited to be having the conversation. I think Jordan touched on one and so did you, Jesse, that I want to get to, which is that psychological safety is when everybody feels great and it's the organization's responsibility. And we are all personally responsible for our own well-being. and for how we show up. And organizations and the work I do supporting my organization and others in creating psychological safety is creating the environment for someone to thrive, but people have to meet us there. And that does mean putting in work. And I think that touches on what you said, Jesse, of doing work is uncomfortable. It takes vulnerability, it takes discomfort, it takes unpacking. And so it's not that it's not that toxic positivity, like psychological safety is everything's great and everyone's always happy. It is challenge, it is hardship. And coming into my organization, my current organization now, as I did kind of at the beginning of COVID, we are such a strong bonded team because we thrived through something challenging together as a team. And I think that's a really important piece to not lose sight of, because change is happening all around us. That's a big thing a lot of places are talking about and can be hard for people, but how you come out of it can be even stronger. And so I think that's what kind of is coming up as I'm hearing you talk, is the strength and the growth that happens. But that has to be met with an organization and places that let someone show up as their full self.
Yeah. Yeah. Like even as you're chatting there, I think of some of like Clark's work, like Tim Clark's work, and we can put a few links in our follow-up notes after for people, maybe even Lil's podcast as well. We'll put in there for you too. But you know, like that first stage being everyone's entitled to belong is like, just because you're a human, you deserve to belong. And then as you move to the other stages, it's a social two-way exchange, in that like, I will encourage and support your learning in exchange for your engagement in learning. Like, and I think before it's just assumed that you should just give it to me, and that's not the case. You need to show up and do something. Just as within contributor safety, like I will provide autonomy in exchange for successful completion of a task. So it's not, you're not supposed to get the right. And I often tell stories about like when we were potty training one of our youngest. If I just went to full autonomy, it's like, here's the toilet, figure it out. And that's not what happened. You had to build in the successful completion of certain stages. And that might be a silly example, but the same thing happens inside of organizations when we bring in new staff or you're creating new initiatives or whatever, is that we want to support, foster accountability. And then as people demonstrate success, we kind of free up and allow them to flourish even more. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, Jesse, just to really bring home a workplace question that I'm living with, I have a lot of people that approach me and say, I'm struggling, I'm having a hard time. And some of it is occupational and some of it is not. And I oversee the department that looks at our employee family assistance program. And when I look at the utilization of that program and see that it is, national averages are around, if you're lucky, 12%. Well, that seems disproportionate to the number of people saying, I need help with something. And so, my first question is often, well, what have you tried? Have you leveraged the resources available? And it's a tough love message sometimes to say, like, your wellness or your safety is not something that is going to be given to you. It is something that we have to work at together, is a really important message to drive home here, because you can have all the best programming in the world. You can have a culture and an environment that supports that. But this really is a contracted agreement that has to exist between employers and employees for it to bear fruit. And part of that, and I think we're going to get to this later in the not in the podcast. This is my programming in the session, is really about the role leaders play in modeling that, removing barriers and addressing that self-stigma that so many people are holding, and why they don't access the supports that are available.
And if I may, I'll maybe just add, not an opposing view, but maybe something that shifts it in a different direction. There's some emerging research specifically around psychological safety and, kind of the way Edmondson and Clark define it. And understanding that, often leaders assume that everybody has the same experience or access to psychological safety. And that's also not true. And that comes back to questions of ultimately privilege. And that, leaders might say, we're going to create a psychologically safe work environment, and they might apply methods to do that uniformly across their team or across their organization. But there are people in every organization and every team that are more likely and less likely to experience psychological safety quickly. Right? And so while I understand there's a responsibility on both sides of the table, I think it's also important to acknowledge that it's not 50-50 in every circumstance. And that balance has to shift. So, for example, if you're a white male in a leadership position, right? The chances of you entering into a team and automatically experiencing a degree of safety is higher than someone who is, for example, a new immigrant or a new worker in Canada, right? So there's a level of privilege that comes with this conversation, and we can't just say this is what we do and this is what you do. It actually does need to be a bit more nuanced and individualized than that, because we're not all starting on the same playing field.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point. It reminds me of two things in terms of where we see challenges, even in the mix up and somewhat of a side conversation, but between equality and equity can be challenging, particularly in a unionized environment where everyone is entitled to the same at times. It sometimes gets in the way of fostering true support. The other one that I see is as relates to how do we live our values and the dynamic between values and beliefs. And we might even explore this in a further session, but to me, I think there's such a fixation on the beliefs of how you live your values versus the commitment to the values, meaning like, I want to care for my community. Well, in that care for my community, you might have to challenge your beliefs on how you do it, because it's possible as the community changes, as your team changes, the ways in which you demonstrate care for your community or your team might change or might be different based on the needs. And I think that also speaks to why it's so challenging, is because you're constantly having to reframe, relook at, re-explore, and really connect with the people around you. And it speaks actually to our next question, where is a really nice transition around like leadership. And something that we think about is open and vulnerable leaderships are fairly critical. And I think both of you touched on this in different ways. And I'm just curious, like, what are you seeing as some of the most critical things that those individuals can do, or how they're showing up in terms of creating that vulnerability? And maybe we'll start with Lilian, and then we'll go to you, Jordan.
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. So I do think it starts with the role leaders play in making safe spaces for someone to bring their specific experience. And Jordan, I completely agree with you. I think that we're not coming from the same set of histories, whatever that looks like. But everyone is coming in with their own experience. And I'm going to use the word trauma, not maybe correctly, but like their own little t or big T traumas, whatever that looks like for someone, their own histories, their own stories. And part of it is how leaders look at stratified data by your most, marginalized groups to see if there's something that's not uniformly affecting somebody, creating opportunities for voices and their perspective to be shared. But I do think that unless your leadership is showing up vulnerably, it doesn't make it safe. And generally, as we know, the most, disproportionately affects people that are the most marginalized. So sometimes I have to really focus on the things within my control and how I show up as a leader in my organization. And I'll give you an example because I like anecdotes. So I was set to present to our senior leadership team for months in advance about psychological safety through COVID, which was, I think, in some ways a nice space for that conversation to start. And I had a set list of things to speak about and some of the best practices. But what happened was 8 days prior to that, my mom passed away. And what I showed up with and talked about in that presentation was how these things showed up in my life. And it shocked me how many people came up to me after that presentation and said, and it was a virtual presentation, so I'm speaking almost like today to, actually, there was no other faces on the room, so all I could see was my own, which was a very strange experience, but I had no idea who I was talking to. But the number of people that came up to me afterwards and said, like, I didn't know we were allowed to talk about these things. Thank you so much for sharing that. I've never heard somebody kind of talk about their own experience in this way. And what that really flagged for me is that when we show up in our humanity, we make it safe for other people to show up in their humanity. And as leaders, people are paying attention. People are seeing what you do and what you make safe and what you make accessible in the workplace. And that was really a gift. And what that enabled us to do was have fireside chats where we had senior leaders at our C-suite and above, like C-suite and all kind of senior managers all around, talking about their own experiences from a whole multitude of perspectives. And one of our values organizationally is to celebrate authenticity. And that's one way we do it. And so it has, to your point, Jordan, allowed us to have more of those personalized conversations about those different experiences. And it's actually affected the way we program, because now we program in specific ways based on what the risk factors or what the presenting challenges or just the lived experiences are of the people in our space. So and we are a unionized environment as well. So we start kind of with cross applicable to everybody. And then we have other things that we've built on, including grief support, substance use support, and other things that really allow us to meet someone where they're at and remove the barrier so that no matter how you're showing up, it's giving you an opportunity to be seen and supported in that way.
Yeah, thanks for sharing.
I
love the story there of like, oh yeah, go ahead, Liv.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, because I just think, Lynn, it was just so beautifully put how you just gave an example of how you're vulnerable and trying to model that within everybody else as well. Because even before we started chatting live with the audience now, I remember, I think it was somebody had asked Jordan, for example, like, how are you today? And Jordan actually took a moment. You're like, that's a good question. Like, how actually am I? And then you gave us a really honest answer. And same with you, Lilian. It was just I feel like that question is answered on autopilot so frequently. And it's always, I'm good, thanks. How are you? And we're just trying to get to the point of the meeting or the conversation or whatever. But that's such a great entry point into being vulnerable. If you just answer that first question super honestly, and then it can set the tone for the day, the team, the meeting, whatever it is. Just a little comment is just like a little entryway for people to begin to be vulnerable.
I love the point, Liv, especially about like just create like 3 seconds before even answering. And it kind of feeds into a question I was going to have for Jordan, because I think, Lilian, you showed an intense moment of vulnerability that created a wake. And I also think on the other side, there's also like, how do we do something consistently where it's like every day? And so my question to you, Jordan, I know you support leaders like I do, like what type of things could a leader do where it's like on a daily basis, maintaining a consistency of vulnerability? Does anything jump out of you as like, here are some real simple and also impactful behaviors that you can do to foster that vulnerable and model that vulnerability?
Yeah, thanks, Jesse. And you know me and my penchant for getting down to the very practical very quickly, and so I appreciate the question. Liv, I mean, I was actually going to share exactly what you shared. It's sort of one of my secret weapons, and something that I actually become known for with many of the people that I work with, is that intentional pause when someone asks you, how are you doing today? And even role modeling that to a degree of vulnerability and giving an honest answer. And the example that it's not an example, I'll share kind of an analogy and then I'll share an example. And they're both really brief. But I have a 3-year-old daughter. Her name is Charlotte. And there's probably many people on this call that either have or remember having toddlers. And when you have a toddler, or when you are a toddler, your sort of emotional range and understanding, as well as your ability to regulate it, is pretty minimal, right? So my daughter Charlotte, she's either overjoyed, furious, I don't know, content, or like hangry, right? Like those are really her only 4 emotional states. And as we grow up, we develop this beautiful understanding of what it means to be human, all the different emotional states that go with that, and the nuance between angry and irritated and overjoyed and content or happy. And then we get into work. And I don't know who told us this, but we've sort of been told over generations that it's actually okay not to use that really amazingly intelligent vocabulary and understanding that we've developed. We like revert to toddlers back in the workplace. Fine, good, okay, stressed, and hangry is probably still on the list, right? So really simply for leaders, even just embracing some of that emotional vocabulary that you have is also really important. And then I get lots of questions from leaders about vulnerability. When they hear it all the time, you need to be vulnerable, you need to be more vulnerable, you need to let people see you as a human. And admittedly, for a lot of leaders, that is still really tough. You don't need to be vulnerable in the sense of unloading every personal circumstance or stressor that's impacting you in your life. We all have a right to privacy, and many of us want to maintain it in the workplace. But you can also be vulnerable about work stuff, right? If like connecting on that human stuff is tough, you can be vulnerable on the sort of the shop talk. And so an example, a leader I was working with specifically on psychological safety, he had a sort of a technology-based team of, it was probably a few hundred people, and budget was coming and it wasn't looking good. And so this leader was obviously really stressed, was meeting with their management team to try to figure out how to make the numbers work. And I just pushed him to say, like, there's a problem that you need to solve. You may not have all the answers. And why don't you just open this up to all of your people? And so actually on the next town hall, all staff, with everyone that sort of ladders up to him, he explained the challenge, he explained the constraints they're working with, um, and admitted that he and the management team weren't entirely sure how to make it happen, without losing jobs and having to let people go. And what followed was an amazing discussion. And this leader was so surprised, and that simply by being vulnerable about a problem that maybe they didn't have a clear-cut answer to, the willingness for people to help solve it was outrageous. And so at the end of that conversation in the week following, all of his employees came up with interesting and innovative cost-saving solutions that required that nobody lost their job. And these were all things that that management team hadn't thought of. And so, that vulnerability can be personal, but it can also be work related, and both of them are acceptable and helpful. So
I think you actually, the story you shared there, Jordan, I think is perfect, because I think he shared the complete story of the whole circumstances, as almost like, and to me, I think we've also created this idea that if I share my experience, it's like be perceived as not fact. Well, to me, individual's experience is a part of the facts of a situation you're trying to solve. The nuance, though, I think that you articulate in that story is that the leader you spoke about wasn't emotionally dumping their stress and their strain on the team. They were saying, this is a hard thing, we're unsure. Like, so there was some self-reflection and ownership of their own stuff, and then a clear communication to the group of the context.
And some risk, right?
Yeah.
Like especially for for leaders that come from a background of very hierarchical sort of leadership, that was a really risky thing, and really vulnerable, right? So for someone in a very senior position to say, I actually don't know, I don't know what to do.
Yeah.
It carries a lot of risk. But the reward was immense, by taking that risk.
And I think you spoke to there is like, both in living values and being vulnerable, it gets harder as the perceived risk is greater. And for me, I see risk can often be heightened around mistakes, whether you're worried about making a mistake or you perceived a mistake as a leader. And so maybe I'll go to you, Lilian, like, where you get the opportunity of actually showing up every day and trying to do the things inside of an organization, which, Jordan and I get to come out and just help guide everyone from the side. How do you handle mistakes, like with your team, or even if you're working with leaders inside of your organization?
Well, mistakes happen every single day. I think we all know that. And actually, as part of my if you ever interview with me, I always insist on one question, which is, tell me about a time you made a mistake. What happened? What did you learn from it? And what would you do differently? Mm. And I find that actually a lot of my weighing at the point of recruitment looks at that question. Obviously, you need to have the skill set and, all of that, but it's such a powerful question because how someone responds to it tells you so much about their growth mindset. It tells you about their ability to learn and adjust and their willingness to be vulnerable. And so I know that's obviously at the point of recruitment, but I make a point of emphasizing that as a point because we're all going to make mistakes. And again, it goes back to that leadership modeling. So Jordan, I love that you talked about the fear of saying, I don't know. As I mentioned, I started in my role right at the beginning of a completely unprecedented situation that we lived through at a global stage. And I felt like I would surely be imminently fired because my most common answer to something was, I don't know. And I talk about that a lot with leaders who feel this pressure to have all the answers. and who feel this pressure to never make a mistake and to be perfect. And again, it goes back to what I shared earlier about people are looking at you as a leader. They are watching what you signal as safe. And so if you always have an answer, if you never make a mistake, then it's not safe for them to do so.
That's a good
And
point.
so I think it's really about sharing when we have learning opportunities and growths, and also when we are mentoring or kind of supporting our teams, acknowledging that mistakes happen and where we go from them is an opportunity to pivot and shift, and that we always have that chance to course correct. So there's very little that can't be learned from and kind of remediated. But we obviously want to make it safe for them to get to us before we're at that situation. And how we make it safe before that situation is by creating that culture.
Yeah. And I think some of the culture you speak to around like where that fear can become big about mistakes, it really stifles the culture in terms of trying new things or being worried for blamed if it doesn't work. And Jordan, what do you think from a leader perspective are some things that, a leader can do? Because again, I always feel in any social exchange, there's almost fear is going to exist. To me, if you step back, it's almost unprecedented to think that any individual be willing to say something in a group setting, because the actual easier option is to stay quiet because you don't risk rejection or social isolation. So like, it's why it is so hard. So like, as a leader, like, is there anything that jumps out outside of the things that Lilian had said as to, here's some critical things about how we create openness to try new things and try to mitigate or helps navigate the fears of being blamed or being rejected, really?
I mean, about a million thoughts. I'll try to condense it. I think the critical thing for leaders is having people see how you respond to intelligent failure. And I use the word intelligent failure really intentionally because there is some failure that is just simply unacceptable in a work environment, right? And Lil, from a health and safety perspective, you see this and understand this very well. Like there are just some mistakes we cannot make because the risk of harm is far too great. But there are so many mistakes that we can make in our work that actually have very little real world impact other than perhaps minor inconvenience. And so for leaders, how you respond to mistakes that are made in the attempt to do something good is maybe the most critical thing here. And that's how you take mistakes and make them learning opportunities. The other, I think, really important thing for leaders is being mindful of something called impression management. And this is where, what many of us are sort of taught to do from a very young age. And I'll kind of bring it back to toddlers. Think about young kids. And even, the biographies for Lilian and myself that were read even before we got on, right? Those biographies and Liv did a great job of ad-libbing, right? They're all written to convey some sort of impression to you about who we are, right? And leaders, whether they realize it or not, end up doing a lot of impression management. And what you're trying to do is really manage the image that others have of you. And ultimately, it's a pretty damaging behavior when it comes to creating safety within team. Typical behaviors that would signal impression management would be things like taking credit for things that someone on your team did, not you, or magnifying the impact of something that you've accomplished to make it sound better than it is, or saying yes to things that you absolutely know can't be done, and then sort of playing it off as complete or when it's really only half finished, right? Those are examples of impression management. And impression management is one of the biggest things that creates a sense of fear in your people because ultimately if mistakes happen and you're trained to manage impressions as a leader, ultimately what you're going to do is blame. So if mistakes happen and I'm trying to manage my image, instead of treating them as learning opportunities, I'm actually going to blame them on someone else to protect my own image, right?
Yeah.
And so letting go of a bit of the ego of a leader and being mindful of, when you're trying to manage others' impressions is also really critical in terms of creating that safe environment where people feel okay making a mistake. If every time someone makes a mistake, they see them get blamed for it so that the leader can continue to look good, well, they're never going to want to talk about mistakes and they're never going to want to learn from them.
Yeah, so it comes back to me where when I get to work with leaders, it's like 99% of the stuff is how is that leader figuring out how to navigate their own insecurity and even like to be frank, like their own shit. Because we all got it. It's like how are we navigating that?
Okay, so we've broken that barrier now, right? So I was going to say half-assed, so now we're good. Yeah.
Last question, and then we'll open up to see if there's some audience questions, and then we've kind of got a few closing traditions that we're going to be doing. I'm going to challenge you to keep it to like 1 minute to 90 seconds, and if you had to give the audience here one consideration to make on what would be an actionable step that you could do towards fostering psychological safety. And I'm going to invite you to share it as if you're an individual who gets the opportunity to construct the environment and norms. If you're an individual who's a leader and has to facilitate, the team culture, or if you're a staff member who needs to individually contribute. So I'll invite you to pick one, and I'm not even going to force you to pick which one, but maybe we'll start with you, Jordan. Which one are you going to pick, and what's your one tip you have for us?
Okay, well, you've given me 90 seconds, right?
Yep.
I can do all three in 90 seconds. So if you're constructing an environment, what's really important is finding ways to celebrate intelligent failure and recognize effort, not just outcomes. That's really important. If you're a leader, I think one of the most important practices you can engage in is simply asking for feedback from your team on how you're leading. They're going to give you 90% positive, 10% constructive. That 10% is really actually very important. And then as a staff member, an employee, I think one of the most important things you can do is build connections and individual human relationships with your coworkers. That goes a long way to helping build that sense of inclusion.
Awesome. Thanks. That was pretty skilled, Lilian. I don't know if you'll be able to match the 90-second time frame, but I'll leave it to you to go ahead.
It's the benefit of going second, is what he said. But I might add to it by just saying, listen, especially at the organizational and leadership level. That pressure to have all the answers, that pressure to fill in the silence, that pressure to know all the things is not always what serves us. So listening, pausing, leading with curiosity is a really powerful way to invite somebody to feel safe, to offer perspectives and innovation. I mean, ultimately, when you have psychological safety, you have innovation. To Jordan's point about you're giving people the latitude to, within certain parameters, try new things and learn through new opportunities. So listening, and then from an individual level, I would say trusting if it's safe to do so, and building connections and community. We are so socially disconnected that how we create those opportunities is one of the things that I do think is within our individual control. So another thing I didn't touch on is we have employee resource groups, again, to recognize that not everybody has the same experience, but creating communities, especially within large workplaces, participate in them. If you have the opportunity, and if you don't have the opportunity, maybe start one. Or create something not maybe formal, but a space where you can have those connections.
Yeah, thanks. One that as you were speaking there, it made me think of an individual one that has been really sticking out to me recently. And with so much going on, and we're being exposed to so much information at a high pace rate, that is some really fascinating research on it being like what's called like prime messaging, and that it's looked at as prestigious, it's looked at as in-group, it's emotionally charged and often fear-based. So it's like you're totally attention grabbing. In that I found myself actually recently, because there's been a few things that have been happening in Nova Scotia that have been quite intense, relating to some experience of Black Nova Scotians and whatnot. And even with that, I try to sit back like, is this my burden to be holding currently? Because I think sometimes we show up to our work environments really already charged. I've joked with some of my team members that like by the time I get the girls out the door and to school in the morning, like I'm exhausted. like overstimulated. But even with that though, it's like, can we take a breath and think about, do I need to carry this burden anymore? Or is this mine to like put down? Or what's my role within it? Whereas I think sometimes we just pick up all of this energy and feel like we need to carry it and may not be aware of how it's impacting, our sensitivity or our irritability when moving through the world. And maybe before we open up to some Q&A to the audience, let those filter in. I'll see if either of you has a comment you want to add to that.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in on that one, because something I talk a lot about is being aware of your emotional states and how you're coming in to, whatever space you're coming into. And Jordan, it's funny you said hangry, because one of the things we talk about, and that comes from the addictions literature, is something called HALTs. So are you hungry, angry, lonely, tired, sleepy, scared, or stressed? And Jesse, I appreciate you sharing the story or your anecdote about coming in and just getting the kids off to school, being that emotionally, you're coming in with whatever you're coming into. But imagine that you were a single parent. Imagine that you were now late for a job that was threatened, and also holding perspective and privilege about the fact that you have this family, that you have this role, that you have all these things, and just pausing. So silence and pausing are two really important things, because we're on autopilot so much.
Oh, I
And
couldn't
just slowing
agree more.
things down. Yeah,
Couldn't
so
agree
just
more.
slowing things down within ourselves, listening to ourselves the same way we would a friend, offering that self-compassion. But to your point, I think not necessarily having to carry that, and choosing when and what we can release in that moment.
Yeah, I deeply agree. Liv, we'll open up to you and invite some audience questions and whatnot. If there are any, maybe we'll take about 5 minutes for that.
Yeah, I think we have a one from Aaron here who says, love all of this content and conversation, and curious if there are any specific recommendations around PS and psychological safety in times of change, and what HR or leaders can do to support the human side of change in terms of psychological safety. I'm not sure, Jordan or Lynn, if either of you feel really called to that.
Oh, so many things. I think in any change, and this is an interesting thing for me to often reflect on, in any change is loss. And in so many ways, change is actually similar to grief, and it's not perfectly similar. But I think understanding and even just simply acknowledging what's lost in change can go a long way to helping that change feel a lot easier. And then the other core principle that I talk about with leaders all the time is that at a fundamental level, when we're thinking about how to make change most effectively, the thing to remember is, and this lines up with psychological safety, is nothing about us without us. And so really calls for involvement and inclusion in change decisions. Not to say that employees get to dictate what those decisions are. We're leaders or managers of organizations that we need to lead and manage. But even if the end result is exactly as you've anticipated it, even having them a part of a conversation can make a world of a difference in how that change is accepted and their willingness to be a part of it. So nothing about us without us.
Maybe Jordan, just to build on that, because I do really think that the concept of loss is important here, and validating that. So sometimes in change, organizations want to sell you on all the benefits. And we're all going through change all the time, as I kind of said earlier. But when you can see someone's hopes, fears, and dreams, and when you can validate, I'm hearing this is hard, I'm hearing this is challenging, I'm hearing this is what you're worried about, tell me more about that. And give involvement and influence where it makes sense. Then people tend to come along the journey with you. But sometimes in change management, you're so excited about something, or it's the direction we're headed, so you just try to kind of steamroll over people, and you're going to lose people along the way. So that listening, that validating, that inclusion of their voice and their perspective, their hopes, fears, and dreams may not bring them along, but at least you know what you're working with, and they feel safe. If they give you the gift of that feedback, then you know that they feel safe to offer it, and that can be such a gift.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with both of what you folks say, because my belief system is there is no pathway without consequence. There's always benefits and consequences. It's just, have we clearly articulated in our minds or in our organization the why, so that we're prepared to accept the consequences. The one thing I did want to add, because I think you two so well captured the process, it to me articulates the importance of the beforehand. And I think about it as like a piggy bank, an emotional bank account you maintain with your staff. If we're not effectively depositing, there's going to be times where we unintentionally withdraw. And there's also going to be times where we intentionally withdraw from that bank account. And if we don't have enough balance to have it be still in a positive sense after that withdrawal, that's where you start to see things start to spiral in the other way, because it is so hard to bring it back. And I think, again, it just speaks to the criticality of being intentional as a leader to say, in this moment, what's the best action I can take? Is it to get the outcome? Is it to service as a coach? Is it to provide some support? Is it foster accountability? Like, what is the thing that can best be serviced in this context, and not just jump into a default? But I loved what everyone had said. Is there any more, Liv?
There is. Yes. Give me a second. Okay. So when there is not psychological safety in a work environment and team, what are some tips to move forward and start to create a psychologically safe environment again? For example, when a supervisor has been a big part of how the psychological safety has been lost.
So this is from like an individual perspective of what can the individual do to perhaps reset some of the norms that maybe were facilitated within a current or previous leader? That's a really tough question. Fortunately, you two are the guests today. Lilian or Jordan, anything to out at you?
Well, I think, Jesse, at the end, don't we get to ask you questions? So can we just skip there now and we'll give that one to you? It is a tough question, and kind of depends on whether that leader is still there versus that leader is gone. But a lot of this does rest with leaders, and psychological safety is primarily a leader's responsibility. That said, some leaders aren't aware it's their responsibility. And so finding intentional ways to provide upward feedback is probably the most foundational way to start. And feedback not framed on what a leader is or is not doing, but framed on what you need to be successful in the organization. What do you need to be successful in the team? What kind of feedback, what kind of conversations, what kind of engagement do you need from that leader to do your job well, is probably the way I think about framing it. And then from a safety perspective across the team, just simply building human relationships. I think that principle still applies, and you can do that with or without the involvement of a leader. Lilian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think my brain goes to the relationship literature and restoration and repair. Mm-hmm. And where that brings me is in the role of acknowledging that maybe someone's experience has not felt safe. And if someone is telling you that, that is a really strong indicator that they are feeling more safe perhaps than they had previously, or holding or looking for a space for that voice to be heard. And so if you can understand that experience, and if you can work collaboratively as a leader to establish that safety back up, it is like your analogy, Jesse, of deposits and withdrawals. I use that a lot, and I see that a lot in the relationship space as well. Like recognizing that the bank account may be in the deficit means you have to put those deposits. And, the Gottmans talk about the 5-to-1 ratio. You need 5 positives. Yeah. So really continuing to build it. But part of it is recognizing, and if you're an individual contributor, maybe asking this question and you're not the leader in the space, then I think the other thing to think about is how can you lead in to create safety with your colleagues and peers, because we don't always control necessarily the full environment. Or even if you're in a large organization and there's different leaders, let's face it, some are maybe more apt to this than others. It's about your own personal role in supporting that and putting those deposits in so that the team is supported and strong. If you are more of that individual contributor.
I think a thought that really complements, Lilian, what you just said is that a leader is not a person with a title. A leader is somebody people follow. And so you may yourself actually be a leader in that team and actually have the ability to influence safety in a really strong way without having the title that comes with being a quote unquote leader on paper. And so don't underestimate your ability to influence it as well through some of the behaviors that we've already talked about.
That's great. I wasn't expecting. I love the Gottmans' work. I'm actually reading their 8 Dates, but I don't know if either of you come across that book. It's such a solid book on building the foundations of meaningful, long-lasting relationships. Highly recommend it for those interested. We're getting towards the end, which I can't believe we're here and we made it maybe just under the wire. We do have two questions. So one of them is, do either of you have a question for Liv or I? Hopefully can keep it to something short so that we can move to wrap up for everyone and keep on time.
Well, maybe I can start because I hearing such excitement about the intentional shift this is making or intending to have. So what does success look like for you?
Oh gosh, I said like a short answer.
Easy.
It's a really good question. For me, I think currently it's about doing it and doing the work and creating the feel we want to create this session and recognizing and Liv and I were speaking earlier this week, like we're probably going to make a bunch of mistakes along the way and recognizing that that's okay. And let's create some space for that so that we can continue to learn and hopefully create something that does spark change in people. But I think right now it's about the willingness to show up and learn along the way and really have some fun, awesome conversations with awesome people. I don't know if Liv, you have something different or similar.
I want to also say just ditto, but I think also may not, it'll be interesting to see, if we get people who write in that, that this has helped in X way or whatever. But I think even just from the questions that we've received today, if that one person, for example, who asked about the supervisor or whatever, if they're able to take that and have a better change in their workspace, I just think that would be success for me where, we have just one person creating a ripple effect.
And then I'll ask you, and sorry to cut you off, Jordan. We're just running tight on time, but just wanted to allow people to have opportunity to listen to the two of you more. Our last question is, and again, try to keep it to about 30 seconds if you can. What's the best piece of advice or the worst piece of advice you've ever received that you feel so bad you want to warn us of? You can go either way. And I'm watching Jordan's non-verbals there. So I got to go to Lilian first, and we'll give Jordan some time to process.
No, and I got it. I was just thinking, Jesse, you've asked me this question a couple times before. Last time, I think I went on the side of like worst advice I've ever been given, and so I'll go the other way this time. Best advice I've ever been given, and I've passed along to many leaders, is that when it comes to the experience of work, whether you call that psychological safety, inclusion, psychological health and safety, whatever it is, perception is 100% of the game. So it doesn't matter what you think about the work environment, about the team. The only thing that actually matters and carries weight is what your people think of it.
That's great.
And that's maybe some of the most impactful advice I've been given.
Thanks. How about you, Lilian?
Mine is more kind of individually oriented, which is your thoughts are not facts. And
yeah, such a good one.
And I'm going to complement that by saying maybe some of the worst advice. And I have given this advice, and it's a bit nuanced in what I'm about to say, but don't trust or always trust your gut. And the reason I say that is because sometimes when we aren't in our best, it's similar to your thoughts are not facts. And we might be inclined to pull one way and trusting in that gut instinct, but pause, listen, reflect. Those thoughts are not facts. And come to a place that feels right within you rather than kind of maybe the shoulds in the world.
Yeah, thanks so much. Well, thank you for you two for willing to contribute for the last hour and play along. It was such an awesome opportunity for us to sit back and listen, and hopefully those on the call did as well. This will be, our first of quite a few series on human-related topics in the workplace, and so we're super pumped for it. Liv, because I know you're the person who keeps us locked in and on track. When is the next one that everyone can expect to dial in and listen?
The next one is November 19th. I think that's
awesome.
Wednesday or a Thursday. Yeah, but it'll be one a month or so for the next little while.
Awesome. And we've got Shandy McLean is going to be joining us. She's the CEO of Acora, an Alberta-based organization that provides support to organizations across Canada in the EAP and leadership space. And again, super excited to get a chance to chat with her. So hopefully we'll see you all again in that next session. If you're looking for some of the resources that we mentioned, we will post online on the Spark Intentional Shift web tab. And that's where you can find the recording as well as the future sessions to register for. Thanks so much. And again, Lilian and Jordan, thank you for your generosity today and willing to share with us. I really, really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
You're so
Thanks
welcome,
for the
Jesse.
invite.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome.